Okay, we all know where Croatia is, right? I mean, if you're watching this channel, you're probably as obsessed with history and geography as I am. But what if I told you that it used to be somewhere else, here in sort of South Poland, the area of the Carpathian Mountains? It was only after a few hundred years that they migrated into Dalmatia, where they are today. So why did this happen and how? Today Croatia is here, but the people we know as Croats weren't always there. Well, I guess nobody was there to begin with. I mean, we all migrated from somewhere. But even at the start of the second millennium, Croats didn't live in what is today Croatia. That's right? Second millennium. Because the first one is 0 to 1000, and then, yeah, the second one would be 1000 to 2000. So we're in the third millennium? That's new. Instead, way back then, they lived over here, in the tri-border area of modern Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine. It was known as White Croatia or Great Croatia, and it gives us an example of a people that just essentially picked up and moved their entire country somewhere else. This is a bit of an exaggeration, of course, for many reasons that we're going to learn about, but it isn't that far from reality. So why did it happen? In this video, I want to teach you 3 things that I learned myself while doing the research for this. First, who these White Croats were and how they got there. Second, why some of them moved to modern Croatia and how that move went. And third, what happened to their ancestors in the Carpathians, and essentially why 2 Croatias don't exist today. Now, we already know where they were, these White Croats, in this region northeast of Hungary. So I think it's important we also find out who they were. The White Croats were a group of early East Slavic tribes. They lived in the historical region of Galicia, north of these Carpathian Mountains. Nobody's really sure how they got there from wherever they came from. Their name is usually considered to be of Iranian origin, from Aurvata, meaning cattle guardian, or from the Proto-Ossetian Shurvat, meaning one who guards, not necessarily cattle. It's relevant to remember how Croatia's modern endonym, what they call themselves, is Hrvatska. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. A more similar term to that potential origin. This somewhat questionable map shows a potential full migration route for these people, starting precisely in northern Iran, moving to the Caucasus and Ukraine, then White Croatia, and then the Balkans. Why they were also referred to as white is a whole other question. The most relevant theory seems to be that old Eurasian people associated colors to specific cardinal directions: black for north, green for east, white for west, and red for south. That makes it a bit odd, though, because these Croats were to the east of modern Croatia, making us think that maybe at the time they had come from even further east, if it was referred to as white. A lot of people even associate the name of Belarus with White Russia because it was to the west of Russia, maybe. At least it would make sense in this color cardinal connection context. That was 4 C's in a row. This theory also makes sense when we read the Chronicle of the Priest of Duklija from the 12th century, which refers to the settlement of Croats in Dalmatia as Red Croatia because it was to the south. The original White Croatia is often referred to as Great Croatia, too, from the ancient Megali. This was probably not an association with size, but rather with the sense of old or former homeland. And something else that is really interesting is that most historians agree that these Croats were among the first of the East Slavic to sort of unite under a common single identity. Hendrik Lomianski, a Polish historian and academic with a suspicious-looking mustache, argued that the tribe was formed between the 3rd and 5th centuries in Lesser Poland, close to that Galicia region too. Some archaeological evidence, though, points to them coming from somewhere in the Caucasus or around Ukraine and Crimea, so maybe the map that we saw earlier isn't as questionable as I thought. Maybe coming from as far as the Urals and Central Asia, as was the case with many of these East Slavic tribes. This would also make sense with the white meaning west thing. And regardless of that origin, now we know who they were, how they got here, and potentially where they came from. So, what was it like in White Croatia? Some research shows that their existence was pretty close to an actual country. They weren't just a random group of scattered people in small villages. Archaeological digs have found city-like fortified settlements in places that now correspond to Stilsko, Revno, Halik, and Terebovlia, among many others. They were pagan, as was also the case with most others around them at the time. In regards to the exact location of this proto-state, the main source we have about it is a 10th century treaty called On the Management of the Empire, written in Greek by Constantine VII, the 4th Byzantine emperor of the Macedonian dynasty. In chapter 30, which is called The Story of the Province of Dalmatia, where Croatia now partly is, he writes, "The Croats at that time were dwelling beyond Bagi Bareja, where the Bello-Croats are now, that is, the White Croats. They are unbaptized." This confirms a few things. First, that they were pagan, then that they came from another place other than Dalmatia, and third, that the original people were called the White Croats. Just after, in chapter 31, title Of the Croats and the Country They Now Dwell In, it says, "Croats in Dalmatia are descended from those unbaptized Croats, also called the White, who border the Slavs." Kind of just repeating what we just read in the previous chapter. It's interesting to think, right? I mean, this is an emperor writing a document about his vast empire, and he's trying to get the word count up like we do in school essays, but just repeating the same thing in a different context or in a different way. But anyway, something else that gives us a hint about their initial location is how he writes that they live far from the sea. It takes 30 days to travel to reach it, a sea that is called dark, I think necessarily referring to the Black Sea. Constantine also writes how these White Croats were constantly harassed by other tribes from the east, namely the Peshnegs and the Avars. This could have been one of the motives that pushed them to leave their homeland and migrate south. Another reason could have been due to Byzantine politics themselves. The Roman Empire was struggling to control the Balkans in the east after the collapse of the western part of the empire. As a consequence, they invited or at least tolerated Slavic tribes to move in, settle in depopulated or unstable areas, and owe loyalty to the emperor in return. In fact, according to that same Constantine VII, the Croats would have been invited to settle in the region of Dalmatia by Emperor Heraclius in the year 610 to fight the invading Avars in the region. Whether this is true is up to our interpretation, as there are no contemporary records from the Croats themselves. But then modern researchers have written that, in fact, Croats arrived with the Avars, plundering the region together. It's really quite confusing. We have to reconstruct the moment based on the secondary sources by the Byzantine, the Franks, and sometimes Slavic sources, but much later ones. There are also other reasons that could have pushed them south. The Franks were pushing their influence east, destabilizing the Carpathian region. This could have encouraged migration south. The Slavic tribes were also booming in population, and the Carpathian Mountains offered a limited arable land. Maybe there were just too many and left to seek more and better land. Or maybe the Croats didn't all move. Maybe it was just a branch of the larger White Croatian tribe that carved a new identity and moved elsewhere to assert it separately from their ancestors. Similarly to before, we weren't sure how they got to White Croatia. We're also not sure why or how they moved from White Croatia to Dalmatia to establish Red Croatia or Modern Croatia. There's a lot of Croatias here, but either way, they did. This fantastic painting by Oton Ivekovic depicts the coming of the Croats to the Adriatic. It was painted in 1905, and it shows us that at least the migration itself has been taken as somewhat historical, if not at least mythical, for a good amount of time. Vojtovic, a Ukrainian historian, advances the idea that there were two waves of Croatian migration to the Balkans. A first massive one in the 6th century, where they would have moved from Galicia through Pannonia and Bosnia, starting their conquest of Dalmatia, with the second one coming in the 7th century to finish it. But many question this dual migration theory. It doesn't really make sense from a practical point of view, and so most historians think that if it happened, there was only one. Again, dealing with quite some uncertainty on the how and when. What we know is that at some point, in some amount, they arrived mostly here, to Dalmatia, an old province of the Roman Empire, either along with the Avars as invaders or by the emperor's request as settlers and defenders. But the province wasn't empty. The Dalmatians already lived there. Sure, some may have been overrun by these invasions, but many still lingered in the coastal fortified cities, especially. And the arrival of the Croats didn't really force them out. A Latin and Romance population persisted, specifically in cities like Zadar, Split, Trogir, and Dubrovnik, where Byzantine influence was high. Later, that Byzantine influence was replaced by a Venetian one, through Venice's coastal colonial empire across the Mediterranean, and so the Latin and really Italian influence remained. The Croats didn't eliminate or replace the Latin legacy, rather they incorporated their own culture into it. And in fact, I would go so far as to argue that today Croatians are the least Slavic of the Slavic people. They're basically half Latin. Maybe if they had stayed behind, that wouldn't be the case, as we see with other East Slavic people in Eastern Europe. Even the local Dalmatian language, which I made a video about recently, survived in pockets until super late, with the last speaker only dying in 1898. There's actually a pretty funny story about the way that the language ended. Apparently it was only spoken, or at least understood, by this one single guy at the end of the 19th century, and then one day he was just walking around and he tripped on some early form of a landmine and he just exploded. So I guess the language really went out with a blast. Early Croat settlements concentrated in inland Dalmatia, Lika, later into Croatia proper / Slavonia, organized in something they called Županje. They were essentially districts under a knez, who was essentially a duke. They arrived as pagans, as their white Croat ancestors were, but soon they converted to Christianity. Pretty quickly, really, around the 9th century. And this may have happened for at least two reasons. First, to integrate with the locals more easily and be able to gain legitimacy to rule them. And second, to assert a level of sovereignty. By the year of 879, Pope John VIII wrote a letter to Croat Duke Branimir with papal recognition of Croat independence from both Carolingian and Byzantine claims in exchange for their conversion to Christianity, in part. But their status was of de facto sovereignty since they arrived. The Byzantines only held control in those coastal cities, while the newly arrived Croats quickly took control of the interior. They could be considered Byzantine vassals for a little bit, but not really. After the Croat duchy was officially recognized by the Pope in 852, it quickly evolved into its own kingdom by the year of 925. But their quick ascension was almost as quick as their demise. By 1102, a dynastic crisis resulted out of a war, and the Croats were forced into a personal union with Hungary. King Koloman of Hungary effectively annexed the Croat lands. Croatian state rights symbolically persisted during Hungarian and then Habsburg rule over vast centuries, but mostly in name other than anything else. After World War I, they regained partial independence through the kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which then turned into Yugoslavia. And only in 1991, exactly 889 years after losing their full sovereignty in 1102, did they regain independence as their own nation. And so now we kind of come to modern times for Croatia proper. But what happened to the other ones, the White Croats, the ones that didn't migrate to Dalmatia and stayed behind in the Carpathians? Well, essentially, they didn't survive through a polity of their own, if that polity even really ever existed. They were absorbed into larger formations, controlled by other Slavic groups around them, the Kievan Rus, the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, Poland, or even Bohemia. Over time, they merged into the populations of those nations. And while the so-called Red Croats mixed with the Dalmatians too, it was different. They were in control and in the majority. The White Croats were subjects and in the minority, so their unique identity just sort of faded away over time. And so we understand how Croats came from somewhere in the east. They first settled in these Carpathian Mountains, establishing some type of proto-state known as White Croatia. Why they, for some reason, at one point migrated south to Dalmatia and went on to establish the country that we today know as Croatia proper. They weren't the only country that moved around or the only people that moved around. In fact, in the vicinity, there's pretty good examples of that too. Bulgaria, for instance, or Hungary, where they came from, Magna Hungary, somewhere in Russia. I made a full video about this, so I talk about all of those examples over there if you want to check it out. It's from a couple of years ago. And thank you for watching this video. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.